I think is happening is I think there are fake people on the payroll. I think that paychecks are getting sent to people who do not really exist.
You guys, so a week before Charlie lost his life, he expressed some concerns about the finances at Turning Point USA.
Answers? Because according to new claims spreading online, donors connected to Turning Point USA are publicly questioning where their money went. And suddenly, Erika Kirk looks visibly rattled. This didn't start as a scandal. It started as questions about how donations were used. Questions about promises versus results. Questions that were allegedly ignored until they weren't. Now, clips are circulating that show Erika appearing tense, defensive, and overwhelmed as donors press for explanations. Viewers say her tone shifts. Her confidence cracks. And instead of clarity, there's confusion, deflection, and panic. But here's what made this explode. Multiple donors are claiming they want their money back. Not quietly, not privately, but out loud. And once refund demands enter the conversation, everything changes. Because refund demands aren't about politics or ideology anymore. They're about trust, no receipts shown publicly. No formal audit released. Just donors saying this is not what we paid for. And when that narrative takes hold, the damage isn't just reputational, it's structural. Online commentators argue that Erika's reaction is the real story. Not the accusations themselves, but how she responds when confronted. The hesitation, the visible stress, the way answers feel rehearsed instead of direct. Silence didn't calm this down. Clarification didn't arrive. And now the internet is doing what it always does, connecting dots faster than facts can catch up. So the real question isn't whether fraud happened. The real question is if everything is clean. Why do donors feel betrayed, and why does Erika look like she's losing control of the room? The situation involving Erika Kirk didn't erupt because of a single accusation. It escalated because of collective frustration, and that distinction matters. According to online accounts and circulating clips, the donors now speaking out aren't making identical claims word for word. What they share instead is a common feeling. They don't recognize the outcome they were promised at the center of those complaints. Are donors associated with events and fundraising tied to Turning Point USA? These donors say their concerns weren't initially about wrongdoing. They were about clarity. Where did the money go? What specific initiatives were funded? What measurable results were achieved? Those questions, according to donors, when unanswered were answered in ways that felt vague and inconsistent. This is where the situation began to spiral. Several donors claim they were told funds would support clearly defined goals, outreach, organizing events, or specific programs. Over time, as updates slowed or failed to materialize, donors say they began comparing notes. That comparison is what turned isolated doubts into a shared grievance. Importantly, donors have not released a unified document or audit. There's no single smoking gun presented publicly. What exists instead are statements of dissatisfaction, recorded confrontations, and online posts, describing a breakdown in trust. Trust is the key word here. When donors contribute to political or advocacy-related causes, they're not just buying a product, they're buying into a mission. When that mission feels unclear after the fact, the emotional response is stronger than in ordinary transactions. Disappointment turns quickly into suspicion. Even if no formal finding exists, clips circulating online show moments where Erika is confronted with pointed questions. In those moments, viewers say her demeanor shifts noticeably. She appears less composed, more defensive, and at times overwhelmed by the volume of questions rather than their content. Commentators argue that this reaction, more than any claim, fueled the perception of panic. Panic doesn't require guilt to exist. It can also come from loss of control. In high-stakes donor environments, control of the narrative is essential. When donors feel ignored, they stop being private supporters and start becoming public critics. That transition is what many observers believe happened here. Another element that accelerated the TSBO was refund language. Once donors publicly say they want their money back, the issue moves from dissatisfaction to dispute. Refund demands imply a transactional failure. We paid for X and did not receive X. Whether that claim holds up legally is a separate question. But rhetorically, it's power-flying damaging. Online reactions seized on this shift. The conversation stopped being about ideology or alignment and became about accountability. Accountability narratives don't wait for investigations. They build pressure through repetition. Some donors allege that communication broke down at critical moments. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were delayed. Explanations felt circular. Again, these are claims. Not verified conclusions, but they're consistent enough across multiple voices to shape perception. That perception is what put Erika on the defensive. Viewers noted that in confrontational moments, responses leaned toward generalities rather than specifics. Phrases about being misunderstood, about complexities behind the scenes, about timing. None of those explanations are inherently suspicious, but in a room full of donors seeking clarity, they can feel evasive. This is how situations escalate without new evidence. Lack of specificity invites speculation. Speculation invites outrage. Outrage invites amplification. Social media did the rest. Short clips were extracted, captions added, and suddenly the framing shifted from donors asking questions to donors exposing fraud. That leap is critically and dangerous. The word fraud carries legal and moral weight. That's not been established in any formal way. But once the word enters the discourse, it's hard to remove. What makes this particularly volatile is the intersection of politics, money, and identity. Donors don't just feel financially disappointed. They feel ideologically let down. That combination intensifies reactions and reduces patience for ambiguity. From a media analysis standpoint, this is a textbook escalation. Vague outcomes gives donor frustration gives. Public confrontation gives perceived panic gives. Narrative hardening. At no point does this require a proven crime to become explosive. And that's where we are now. The story isn't anchored to documents or audits. It's anchored to emotion and trust erosion. Whether that erosion is justified will depend on facts that have not yet been publicly established. But in the court of public opinion, erosion alone can be enough to cause reputational damage. In the next part, we'll examine why Erika's reaction became the focal point, how panic is interpreted online, and whether visible stress actually proves anything at all or simply reflects the pressure of losing narrative control. Once clips of Erika Kirk began circulating, one word dominated the captions: panic. Viewers said she looked shaken. Commentators said she appeared overwhelmed. Others went further, claiming her reaction was proof that something was wrong. But here's the problem with that conclusion. Panic is not evidence in public confrontations, especially those involving money. Donors and political expectations, stress responses are common. A person can appear anxious for many reasons that have nothing to do with wrongdoing. Loss of control, hostile questioning, unexpected public pressure, or even simple unpreparedness can trigger visible stress. Online. However, nuance collapses. When a clip shows someone pausing, tightening their jaw, or redirecting a question, the internet often treats those moments as confessions without words. That's a dangerous leap. Body language is not a reliable indicator of guilt, especially when stripped of context. Consider the setting described by viewers. A donor-facing environment connected to Turning Point USA, where expectations are high and patience can be thin. Donors feel entitled to answers because they've invested financially and ideologically. That pressure alone can make any public figure appear defensive. What the audience labeled as panic may actually be cognitive overload, too many questions, too little time, and no clear path to satisfy everyone at once. This is where reactions get misread online. Commentary tends to favor clean narratives. Calm equals innocent. Nervous equals guilty. Real life doesn't work that way. Calm can be rehearsed. Nervousness can be situational. And stress often reflects stakes, not secrets. Another factor is editing. Viral clips are rarely neutral. They highlight hesitation and cut out coherence. They freeze frame discomfort and remove clarifying context. A 5-second pause becomes caught. A redirected answer becomes deflection. Once that framing takes hold, it's almost impossible to undo. People then interpret everything through the same lens. Every movement confirms the narrative. Every silence becomes suspicious. This is confirmation bias in action, the tendency to see what we already believe. It's also why public figures often appear worse the more they try to explain. Explanation under pressure can sound circular. Circularity can sound evasive. Evasion becomes accusation. This spiral doesn't require dishonesty. It requires misalignment between expectations and communication. Another reason panic gets misread is the audience's emotional investment. Donors who feel disappointed are primed to interpret stress as validation of their concerns. Viewers who distrust institutions are primed to assume concealment. In both cases, the reaction becomes symbolic, standing in for proof that doesn't yet exist. That symbolism is powerful, but it's not precise. It's also worth noting that accusations escalate language quickly. What begins as questions about funds becomes exposure. What begins as confusion becomes fraud. Each step raises the emotional temperature and narrows the space for measured response. Once the word fraud is introduced without a formal finding, it becomes the dominant frame. Everything that follows gets interpreted through it. Stress becomes panic. Panic becomes guilt. Guilt becomes assumed fact. This is how reputational damage happens before investigations. None of this means donors are wrong to ask questions. Transparency matters. Accountability matters. But interpretation of reactions should not replace evidence. Public pressure can reveal issues, but it can also create false certainty. At this stage, what exists are claims and reactions, not conclusions. The critical question isn't why did she panic? It's what information is missing that would allow this to be resolved clearly. Until that information exists, audits, timelines, documentation, reading guilt into demeanor, risks confusing performance under stress with proof. In the next part, we'll look at why refund demands change the entire narrative, how money disputes escalate faster than ideological ones, and what typically happens when donors publicly demand their funds back, the moment donors began saying they wanted their money back. The story crossed an invisible line. Until then, the situation around Erika Kirk lived in the gray area of dissatisfaction and distrust. Refund demands moved it into a far more serious category. Financial dispute. That shift matters because refund language reframes intent. When donors complain, they're expressing disappointment. When donors demand refunds, they're asserting non-delivery. According to online claims, donors connected to events and fundraising associated with Turning Point USA began framing their concerns this way: we paid for specific outcomes, and those outcomes did not happen. Whether that framing is accurate is not yet established publicly, but rhetorically, it's powerful. Why? Because refunds imply a transaction, not a donation. Most political and advocacy contributions are legally donations, not purchases. Donors don't typically have a right to refunds. But once people speak as if a service was promised and not delivered, conversation shifts from values to value for money. That's when public sympathy often swings toward the donor. Regardless of legal nuance, online reactions intensified immediately after refund demands surfaced. Commentators argued that this language suggested more than miscommunication, it suggested misrepresentation. Again, this is interpretation, not proof. But interpretation is what drives virality. There's also a psychological reason refund demands escalate stories faster. They feel concrete. Vague concerns can be debated. Refund requests feel measurable. They suggest a loss that can be calculated even if the numbers are disputed. This concreteness puts pressure on the person being confronted. Viewers noted that once refund language entered the discussion, Erika's responses appeared more strained, not because refunds were necessarily justified, but because refund demands narrow the response options. You can't easily explain philosophy or long-term strategy when someone is asking, "Where is my money?" That's when conversations turn adversarial. Another factor is collective action. One donor asking for a refund can be dismissed as an outlier. Multiple donors saying it publicly creates the impression of momentum. Momentum doesn't require coordination to be effective. It only requires visibility. Social media amplified that visibility. Screenshots of comments, clips of confrontations, posts claiming others felt the same. Each piece added weight to the idea that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a pattern. Whether that pattern exists, in fact, is still unknown publicly. But the perception of pattern is enough to harden opinion. It's also important to understand how refund demands change risk calculation. For organizations and individuals, refund talk triggers concerns about audits, compliance, and reputational fallout. Even if no wrongdoing occurred, the appearance of dispute can deter future donors and partners. That's why refund narratives are so destabilizing. They don't need a verdict to cause damage. They signal instability. Critics online began using the word expose, but exposure doesn't always reveal wrongdoing. Sometimes it reveals misaligned expectations that were never clarified. Fundraising often involves aspirational language. Donors may hear certainty where organizers intended possibility. When outcomes fall short, that gap becomes fertile ground for conflict. This doesn't absolve anyone of responsibility for clear communication. It highlights how quickly ambiguity can turn into accusation. When money is involved, another reason refund demands changed. Everything is timing. These claims surfaced alongside footage of tense exchanges and alleged panic. The combination made the narrative feel cohesive. Stressed reactions paired with financial demands. The mind connects dots even when the dots aren't proven to belong together. And once that connection is made, reversing it is difficult. At this stage, what exists publicly are three things: donor claims of dissatisfaction public, confrontations and tense reactions, frame demands framed as unmet promises. What does not exist publicly are independent. Audits, formal findings, legal determinations, that gap is crucial. The story is running ahead of verification. Yet, from a media perspective, refund demands changed the trajectory because they raised the stakes. They invited scrutiny from beyond the donor base, journalists, critics, and online investigators. They turned a private grievance into a public test of trust. Whether refunds are warranted will depend on facts not yet shared. But the impact of the demands is already real. The narrative has shifted from what went wrong to who owes whom. To who owes whom. In the next part, we'll examine what typically happens next in situations like this, how organizations respond, what silence signals, and whether transparency can still reset trust once refined narratives take hold. For Erika Kirk, the pressure now isn't just about perception, it's about decision-making under scrutiny. What she chooses to do next will shape how this story solidifies in public memory. Regardless of what the underlying facts eventually show, transparency is what many donors say they want. That typically means clear explanations of how funds were, use documentation or summaries that connect donations to outcomes, acknowledgement of gaps or miscommunication. Theory: transparency can calm a situation. In practice, it's risky. Once documents are shared, they invite interpretation by people who may not understand internal operations. Partial transparency can look selective. Over-transparency can expose unrelated weaknesses. This is why many organizations hesitate. Transparency doesn't just answer questions, it creates new ones. Still, when done carefully and early, it can reset trust. The challenge here is timing. The longer transparency is delayed, the more it looks reactive rather than proactive. And reactive transparency often feels forced. It's not reassuring. Silence is the most common response in fast-moving controversies. It's often advised by legal counsel because statements can be misquoted or used against you later. Silence allows time to assess facts, coordinate internally, and avoid fueling speculation. But silence has a downside. It lets the loudest voices define the story. In this case, donors and commentators are already filling the gap. Without a counter-narrative, silence risks being interpreted as avoidance. Viewers may assume that if everything were clean, clarification would be easy. That assumption isn't fair. But it's common. Silence works best when the audience is small and patient. When clips are already viral and refined language is circulating. Silence can feel like escalation by neglect. Escalation doesn't always mean lawsuits. It can mean donors organizing collectively requests for third-party reviews media. Investigations, public letters, or petitions. Once escalation begins, control over the narrative diminishes rapidly. External actors, journalists, watchdogs, critics step in. At that point, even accurate explanations can be drowned out by process and procedure. For organizations associated with Turning Point USA, escalation can also create collateral impact. Even if the dispute centers on one individual or initiative, the brand absorbs scrutiny. That's why affiliated organizations often push for resolution before escalation takes hold. Why? Timing matters more than intent. Observers often ask, why not just explain? The answer is that explanations don't land the same way once emotions have peaked. Early explanations feel informative. Late explanations feel defensive. Right now, the story is in a fragile middle phase. Donors are vocal, but there's no formal finding. The public is engaged, but not yet settled. That window is where outcomes are decided not by truth alone, but by responsiveness. Another complicating factor is expectation management. Fundraising language often emphasizes ambition. Donors may interpret ambition as guarantee. When outcomes fall short, both sides feel misled if no deception occurred. Addressing that gap requires humility, not just data. The risk of the panic narrative is discussed earlier. Visible stress has been framed as panic. If this narrative hardens, every future action will be interpreted through it. Transparency could be seen as backtracking. Silence could be seen as hiding. Either way, the reaction lens remains. That's why narrative control at this stage. It's less about convincing everyone and more about recentering the facts. Facts won't end the debate, but they can slow it. What typically resolves these situations historically? Situations like this resolve in one of two ways: quiet clarification that satisfies most donors, reducing noise; formal escalation that shifts the issue into procedural channels. Very few end with public vindication or public condemnation. Most end with attention moving on once there's either an explanation or a process underway. The critical point is this: the next move doesn't need to prove innocence or guilt. It needs to demonstrate engagement. Engagement signals respect for donors' concerns. Even if the claims are disputed, and respect, more than certainty, is what de-escalates trust crises. In the final part, we'll step back and examine what this controversy reveals about donor culture, online outrage, and how quickly questions become convictions in the digital age, and what lessons public figures can realistically take from it. By the time a story like this reaches its final phase, something subtle but powerful has already happened. The original questions about money, communication, and expectations have quietly transformed into convictions in the public imagination. Not legal convictions, not proven findings, but emotional conclusions that feel just as solid to the people holding them. That transformation is the most important part of this story, because what happened around Erika Kirk isn't unique. It's a pattern that plays out again and again whenever money, trust, and public identity collide in the digital age. It always starts the same way. Concern gives frustration, gives confrontation, gives interpretation, gives certainty. Somewhere along that chain, nuance disappears. Donors asked questions. Those questions became public. Public questions became accusations. Accusations became headlines. And once headlines form, the burden of proof quietly flips. Instead of claimants needing evidence, the subject is expected to disprove a narrative that may never have been clearly defined in the first place. This is where online culture becomes unforgiving. The internet is not designed to wait for audits, investigations, or measured explanations. It's designed to reward immediacy. Whoever frames the story first often controls it longest. And framing doesn't require accuracy, only confidence. In this case, the word fraud entered the discourse long before any formal determination. That single word changed how everything else was interpreted. Stress became panic. Confusion became evasion. Silence became guilt. Once that happens, every new piece of information is filtered through the same lens. What's often missed is that donor disputes are incredibly common, especially in political and advocacy spaces. Expectations vary. Outcomes are subjective. Communication breaks down. Most of these disputes are resolved quietly because neither side benefits from escalation, but social media changes incentives. Public exposure offers leverage. Leverage invites amplification. Amplification creates pressure. That pressure doesn't always reveal truth. Sometimes it just accelerates judgment. For organizations associated with Turning Point USA, this kind of controversy highlights a broader challenge: how to maintain donor trust in an environment where transparency demands collide with the realities of complex operations. Even when funds are used appropriately, perception can turn hostile if outcomes aren't clearly communicated. For public figures like Erika, the lesson is harsher. In today's media ecosystem, reaction management matters almost as much as action. You can do nothing wrong and still lose control of the narrative. If you're unprepared for public confrontation, and once control is lost, regaining it is difficult, not because facts don't matter, but because they arrive too late to shape first impressions. There's also a responsibility that sits with audiences. It's easy to confuse concern with certainty, to believe that asking hard questions automatically means wrongdoing occurred. But skepticism and judgment are not the same thing. When skepticism becomes performative outrage, stops serving accountability and starts serving entertainment. That doesn't mean donors should stay quiet. Accountability requires voices. But it does mean we should recognize how quickly collective frustration can morph into assumed guilt, as when clips are edited, captions are loaded, and context is thin. This story may eventually resolve quietly. Explanations may satisfy most donors. Processes may unfold away from public view, or attention may simply move on, leaving behind a residue of suspicion that never fully clears. That's usually how these stories end. Not with answers, but with distance. Distance between the moment and the memory. Distance that allows life to continue. Even if reputations are subtly altered, the real takeaway isn't about whether accusations are true or false. It's about how modern narratives are built and how easily questions become convictions before facts ever catch up. In the end, trust is fragile on all sides. Donors want assurance their money mattered. Public figures want fair judgment. Audiences want clarity. Social media offers none of those things reliably. What it offers instead is speed. And speed is rarely kind to complexity at this point. The story isn't just about claims, donors, or reactions anymore. It's about how quickly the internet decides outcomes, often before facts are finished catching up. Because once words like fraud start circulating, they don't wait for audits. Once clips go viral, they don't wait for context. And once panic gets labeled, it doesn't wait for explanations. That's the danger zone. This is where accountability can turn into assumption, where questions turn into convictions, where pressure becomes punishment without a verdict. So here's the real question. If you have to answer, do you believe public pressure is the only way to force transparency? Or do you think the internet often crosses the line before the truth is even known? If donors feel misled, should they go public immediately, or does that risk destroying trust before facts are verified? And on the other side, if everything is clean, how should someone respond when the narrative is already against them? Silence looks suspicious. Speaking looks defensive. And explaining late looks like damage control. There's no perfect move once the crowd has decided. That's why this conversation matters, because it's bigger than one person. It's about how we judge, how we share, and how much responsibility we take for the narratives we help spread. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. Not the loudest take, the real one. Share this if you think questions deserve answers, not assumptions. Because once a narrative hardens online, even the truth has to fight to be heard.